different things. But first, I'd like to tell you guys a little story. It's something that happened personally to us just about 2.5 months ago. My daughter was unfortunately in an accident, and she broke her arm. She was playing cricket at school, and she fell. And even though it was such a tough time, and of course breaking your arm, she said it didn't really hurt. While we were waiting for the x-rays, I was trying to distract her with funny videos. She was laughing, and we didn't even know if it was broken or not. But I remember the time when she actually started to cry was when she found out that it was indeed broken. And the repercussions of having that broken bone. You see, she had just started her softball season. She loves to play softball, she loves to play baseball, and she was just getting ready for a new season. And she was now going to have to be put in a cast, and she was going to miss the entire season. That's when she cried. I think that she would even say that hurt her more than the actual break itself. You see, that waiting period, that time that she had to do 8 weeks in the cast, it was excruciating for her because she didn't exactly know what was happening underneath the cast. She knew she had to wait. She knew that her bones had to be immobilized and stilled, but she couldn't see the actual healing that was taking place because of the bulky, restrictive cast which she began to hate. You know, and I'd like to propose that we as well have fractures in our own lives, and fractures, they really hurt. Occasionally, we don't even realize they hurt at the time, and it's only later on when we deal with the consequences of that fracture that we begin to really despise the process of feeling broken. Because fractures, they can take a long time to mend. They can take long times of being immobilized and stilled. So unfortunately, I do believe that everyone in this room has dealt with some sort of fracture, maybe not physically. That was our first physical fracture in our family, but emotional. Maybe it's a disappointment, broken promise, a broken vow, being deceived. Relational fractures happen all the time with our loved ones. So as I was mentioning earlier, I want to talk about a certain relationship in the Bible. And that's Jacob and Esau. Many people might recognize Jacob and Esau from the stories that they heard when they were young, and they were twins, twin brothers, and they say that twins share a special bond all throughout life. These boys, they had many, many issues. Now, the story of Jacob and Esau, it spans multiple chapters in Genesis, and my goal today is to kind of get a wide view look into the lives of Jacob and Esau, understanding what happened, what was the point in their relationship where a fracture occurred, and how the Lord was able to heal that fracture. So I'm going to do my best to summarize a lot of Bible. We're going to jump in to a few different points throughout their story. It's going to be in Genesis 25 through 33. And let's just jump in right now to the beginning of their story, which is found in Genesis 25. It says, "Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children struggled within her. And she said, 'If all is well, why am I like this?' So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger.' So when her days were fulfilled to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb." I'm going to pause right there. I think what Rebekah says, "If all is well, why am I like this?" I think that we can all relate to that sentiment. Have you ever said, "Lord, hello, if all is well, if you are good, if you are here, why do I feel this way? Lord, if all is well, why am I like this? So through the story, we see that Esau was born first, and Jacob was holding on to the heel of his brother, and he was born second. They gave the name Esau to the first one, and Jacob to the second one. And as they grew, even though they were twins, they were totally different from each other. Esau was said to be full of hair, red, thick hair, all over his body. And he grew up to be a skilled and powerful hunter. And Isaac, his father, he loved Esau so much because of what Esau was able to produce, the food, the game that he brought home from the hunts. And it was said that Jacob was a mild man with smooth skin, and he was the favorite of his mother. And so in that time, the tradition was that the oldest would get a special blessing from the father and retain the family birthright and control of most of the possessions and as an inheritance. And Rebekah, the mother, she remembered the prophecy that she had whenever the boys were still in her womb, but also responding to her own skewed parental preference. She devised a plan for Jacob to get the blessing and the birthright and not her son Esau. Now this plan, it involved trickery, deceit, lies, and it was executed perfectly by Jacob. Jacob tricks his blind and elderly father to give him the blessing that he had intended to give to his brother Esau. And when Esau comes in to the tent and discovers what his brother had done, let's pick up the story in Genesis 27. In verse 34, it says, "When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, 'Bless me, me also, O my father.' But he said, 'Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing.' And Esau said, 'Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing.' And he said, 'Have you not reserved a blessing for me?' Then Esau answered him and said to Esau, 'Indeed, I have made him your master, and all his brethren I have given to him as servants. With grain and wine I have sustained him. What shall I do now for you, my son?'" Now, I want to pause here because I see this as a really sad story. I know a lot of times Esau gets poked at for the proverbial selling his birthright for a bowl of stew, and the fact is that he didn't desire the right things. His cravings overtook him. He showed himself to be impulsive and probably didn't deserve the birthright. And perhaps he didn't deserve the blessing either. But doesn't verse 34 cause you to feel sorrow and sadness for Esau when he cries out, "Bless me, me also, O my father"? Well then, Isaac does. He continues on, and he proclaims through a blessing that Esau will be sustained by the earth, saying that by the sword you shall live, and Esau will indeed serve his brother and one day break the yoke from his neck. But to be honest, it sounds like a difficult story. Esau would indeed survive, he would be sustained, and he would live off the land, but he would live to fight. He would indeed serve his younger brother. And so you can imagine the anger, the frustration, the disappointment that's welling up inside of Esau. So what does an angered man who has a streak of impulsivity in his past and hatred in his heart do? Verse 41 tells us, "So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing which his father had blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, 'The days of mourning for my father are at hand, and I will kill my brother Jacob.' And the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. She sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, 'Surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise and flee to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him a few days until your brother's fury turns away. until your brother's anger turns away from you and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day?" All right, so again, Rebekah has this great plan. She says, "Listen, I know your brother is really angry, so go stay with your uncle just for a few days and let your brother cool off. And as soon as he's calmed down, as soon as he lets this kind of pass, I'll send word for you to go, but you should go." And in this version, it says just for a few days. Now, here in that moment, a fracture occurred in this family. And we can sort of tell from just the limited verses that I read that there were so many issues, underlying issues that were happening in this family. There was favoritism, there was dishonesty, there was lying and impulsivity. But a noticeable event happened that day that altered the lives for Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, and Jacob. And Rebekah thinks that sending her favorite son away would allow some time for Esau to cool down and perhaps fix whatever was wrong in their relationship. But sadly, that would be the last day that she saw her son, Jacob, because Jacob was not away for just a few days. So Jacob is sent off. He's blessed again by his father to go to a proverbial waiting room. And waiting rooms are terrible, aren't they? I don't think anybody is going to fight me with that statement. When my daughter had her accident, she had to be sedated to correct the misaligned bone. And when she was in the operating room, my wife and I, we waited. And we waited, and it felt terrible because we felt powerless over our situation, over my daughter's situation. I wanted to know exactly what is happening. Are they going to have to put pins in her arm, or are they not? Is she responding well to the anesthesia? Is she waking up properly? Is this something going wrong? Is she going to be okay? We had a million questions and concerns, and they weren't being resolved at the time. I remember pacing around the room. I couldn't keep still. I was waiting, but I was not still. And that was only a period of about an hour and a half. You see, no one enjoys waiting, yet it's an absolute guarantee that we will all wait. Waiting and delays are all throughout Scripture, all throughout our own lives. And if we were to track the amount of time that waiting is said to have happened in the Bible, if we were actually to examine the process that was happening during that waiting time, I think it would give us a greater understanding of the waiting room. I mean, there's so many times that we see waiting in the Bible. It's imperative to the whole story. I mean, from the very beginning, we see waiting in Genesis. Noah waits for the waters to recede. Abraham waits for the Lord to fulfill his promise of the son. Isaac waited 20 years for his twins to be born. Jacob waits with his uncle Laban. Joseph waited in prison. Moses waited in the wilderness. God's people waited lost in the desert. David had to wait after he was anointed to be made king. God's people were waiting in exile, then waiting for the coming of the Messiah. Then Jesus waits 30 years to begin his ministry, and the disciples have to wait for the Holy Spirit to be sent, and now we're waiting for Jesus to return. Waiting is imperative in our life. It would be incorrect to view waiting as just that inconvenient time period between the action scenes. It would be incorrect for us to resolve to avoid all waiting and just plow through to the next season. It's through the waiting that the Lord works on our hearts. And it's not just a time period. It's not just the waiting. It is to be still and know that he is God. So Jacob waits for word from his mother. And a few days go by, and no word is sent. A month passes, and nothing. A year goes by, nothing. 20 years go by in Jacob's life, waiting to hear that his brother has cooled down. If you were just to take a pause and think, what's happened in the last 20 years in your life? If you hadn't seen somebody for 20 years and you just had to catch them up, what all would you have to say? So much happened in Jacob's life, and we really don't have time to get into everything, but let me just hit a few highlights of some key points. So in this time when Jacob is waiting with his uncle, he begins to work as a shepherd, and he works for his uncle. And it's a little odd, but he falls in love with Rachel, his uncle's daughter. You can make the weird family connection there. And he commits to working 7 years for her hand in marriage. Now, this uncle is crafty. Jacob had already shown to be the deceiver and be a little crafty in his dealings, but the uncle was very deceptive. And in some sort of odd trickery, they had a wedding feast, and instead of giving Rachel as his wife, he forces his eldest daughter, Leah, into the dark honeymoon suite, and Jacob sleeps with Leah. The uncle demands Jacob to work another 7 years to also marry Rachel. You could imagine the family dynamics. The sister wives are constantly fighting with each other, jealous of each other, trying to have more sons so that they would please their husband more than the other. And not only that, they brought in their own servants to birth children with Jacob as well. This is a messy, hurtful, deceitful family unit that tricks and lies and is broken and breaks other relationships as well. It's a pattern that repeats for multiple generations. Broken relationships causing deformities and other relationships to be fractured. And maybe you're hearing all this and you might be thinking, well, why are we talking about this today in church? Where is God in all of this disaster of a life that we see in the Bible? Maybe this is Jacob finally getting what he deserves for deceiving his father and Esau. Maybe this is, just the consequences that come with the sin that's in the earth today. And I want to pause here and just consider all the issues and all the things that perhaps have been pushed on you that you did not ask for. Or perhaps our children are dealing with that we have inadvertently hurt or been unfair to. I'm not trying to dismiss injustices or terrible things that have happened throughout your life. I know that a lot of times we find ourselves in situations that we had no plan on being in, with broken families, with sicknesses, depression. And these items are not just reserved for unbelievers. So many times I've talked with people who've prayed to God, and they feel like God is not answering. Their situation just seems to tighten, constrict, and all their hopes and faith, and they wonder, Lord, how did I end up here? I thought I knew God. I thought I was following God. But if all is well, then why am I like this? There's a quote by Alexander McLaren that I found really insightful, and I'd like to share. It should be on the screen as well. It says, often God's delays seem to us inexplicable, and our prayers to have no more effect than if they were spoken to a sleeping Baal, who was a pagan false god at that time. But such delays are merciful. They help us to the consciousness of our need. They let us feel the presence of the sorrow. They give opportunity of proving the weakness of all other supports. They test and increase desire for his help. They throw us more unreservedly into his arms. They afford room for the sorrow or the burden to work its peaceable fruits. So Jacob's 20 years of waiting, they were difficult years. He served a relative who took advantage of him. He would say later on that he changed his wages 10 times. He tricked him on his wedding night. And Jacob knew, that it's time for me to go back. It's time for me to return home. And he goes and he addresses his uncle Laban about leaving. And after 20 years of working for Laban, he had obviously been working and producing, and he was a shepherd, and so the flocks of Laban had been blessed tremendously. And so Jacob proposed that his wages would be that he would be allowed to take all the blemished, all the speckled, striped sheeps and goats, all the black ones as well, and that he would leave the pure white livestock with his uncle. And Laban admits, I know that the Lord has been good to me because he has blessed you, and he agrees to that plan. But then he sneakily instructs his other sons to go and remove all of Jacob's animals and take them 3 days away. We see trickery and deception. It's like Jacob's caught in a loop of being tricked and tricking others and being tricked and tricking others. Either he was deceiving or he would be the one being deceived. And Jacob desired to leave so much that when he saw the opportunity, he took it and he ran. Genesis 31, jumping forward there to verse 19, tells us that Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob stole away, unknown to Laban the Syrian, and that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed toward the mountains of Gilead. And Laban was told on the 3rd day that Jacob had fled. Then he took his brethren with him and pursued him for 7 days' journey and overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. But God had come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad." Other translations say, "Don't mess with Jacob." And so we see in this story, these people are severely flawed and crooked. And maybe you're disappointed in the story and how so many examples of human failure and human deceit are occurring. But don't you see the goodness in this story? The story about a terribly flawed, a terribly fractured family, and that God is still intervening? That God chooses to intervene, that he chooses to speak to this angered man through a dream. Even though these people were terrible at trusting the Lord. I mean, Rachel was stealing her dad's idols. Her dad was hiding Jacob's sheep. Leah was jealous of her sister, and Jacob left without saying goodbye. In all of this mess, their motives were probably wrong, and their actions were definitely wrong, and their devotion to God seemed like it was non-existent. Yet God is working. Even through this broken family, he is intervening and making adjustments along the way, and Jacob makes a covenant with Laban. Peace is made between them. They end this season of 20 years with a form of a peace treaty, pointing to a heap of rocks that was standing next to them. And they agreed that neither one of them would pass that heap of rocks with an intent to harm the other. And in verse 45, it says, verse 55, then early in the morning, Laban arose. He kissed his sons and daughters, and he blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. So we see a form of healing, or perhaps just an acknowledgement that the relationship was over, that he blessed his sons, his daughters, and they departed ways. Things had been really terrible for Jacob and his family. Each person seems to have been on the receiving and the giving end of fractures and disappointments. Jacob had been away waiting, but I wonder what was really happening in his heart. I wonder, did he allow himself to confront the real issues that lay dormant in his heart, the fractures that were and sight of him. Now, I want to remind you guys of Esau's last words recorded regarding Jacob. When Esau said in his heart, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand, and then I will kill my brother Jacob." Now, he had just been reconciled with his father-in-law, or his uncle, and Jacob had been the one who was wronged on numerous occasions for that. But now it was time for Jacob to address the one he had wronged, the one that he had deceived. And you start to wonder, okay, Jacob, did you learn your lesson? Have you changed, or would you be clever and deceitful again? Well, let's see in verse 3 of chapter 32. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, "Speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I might find favor in your sight." And you know, it looked like Jacob was really trying to mend this burnt bridge. He calls him Lord. He calls himself a servant. He mentions that he is independently wealthy and not looking to take anything at all from his older brother. And let's look at the response of Esau. Remember, after 20 years of not talking with him. It says this in verse 6. Then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 companies. And he said, "If Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape." Then Jacob prayed. You see, the response Jacob receives from his messenger fills him with terror. I mean, it would probably do the same to you and I. He's on the way to meet you, and by the way, he has 400 men with him. And that seems like a lot of men for a welcome party. That is a small army or a troop of men on their way to meet Jacob and his unarmed, dysfunctional family who have no fighting experience, at least not like his brother, who was a skilled hunter and was told would live by the sword. Jacob was terrified. And look what he does. He formulates a plan to minimize his losses, and then he prays to the Lord. It's subtle, but don't you see? He did pray, but you can see where his default is not to go first to the Lord to prayer. It's in his own fractured, it's in his own clever thinking. Jacob makes a plan, and then he goes to the Lord. Let's continue on with the story. So Jacob then takes his goats, sheep, camels, cows, and donkeys, and he splits them into 3 groups. And we pick up the story in Genesis 32:16, and it says, "Pass over before me and put some distance between the successive droves." And he commanded the first one, saying, "When Esau my brother meets you and asks you, saying, 'To whom do you belong, and where are you going? Whose are these in front of you?' Then you shall say, 'They are your servant Jacob's, and it is a present sent to my lord Esau. And behold, he is also behind us.' So he commanded the second and third and all who followed the drove, saying, 'In this manner you shall speak to Esau when you find him, and also say, Behold, your servant Jacob is behind us.' For he said, 'I will appease him with a present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face, and perhaps he will accept me.' So the present went on over before him, but he himself lodged that night in the camp." You see, it's so clear in this story. Jacob is always going to Jacob. He made a plan when he heard that his brother was coming with 400 men. He made a plan to minimize his losses, and then he prayed for the Lord to protect him, and then he made a plan to ensure that Esau would not destroy him by giving him his livestock. It's like a clever sandwich with prayer in the middle. And don't we tend to do the same thing, though, before we go pointing fingers at Jacob and saying, oh, how terrible you are? We do something, and then we ask the Lord to bless it, and then we go back again to further the thing that we already did. He wanted to trust the Lord, but he also wanted a little insurance. I mean, really, can you blame him? Wouldn't it be just totally reckless for Jacob to run back to Esau and simply say, brother, will you please forgive me? Surely he must do something else. Surely he must pacify his brother's wrath before he could be in his presence if he were to survive the encounter. The risk was way too high. Jacob had so many flaws in his life, but God was continuing to work in Jacob. And we see God's goodness in this story so clearly, and there's an odd encounter that immediately follows this livestock plan. He sends everybody across the river, his family, his possessions, everything he had. I want to bring up this odd encounter that's in verse 24. And it says that Jacob was left alone. He was totally alone this time. He didn't have servants. He didn't have his family. He didn't have his livestock. He had no possessions with him. He was alone. And a man, capital M, man, wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. He said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and men and have prevailed. Now there's so much that we could dissect and get into this story, but let's just look at it from a very wide angle again. Jacob was alone. He was all alone. His wives and his sons had crossed over. The servants and his possessions, they had been taken. The gift that he was giving to Esau was out of there. He was alone. And it is when he is alone that Jacob is met by what our writer calls a man. And later we are told indeed is God. And all Jacob can really do to get through the night is to cling on to God and not let go. That would be the only thing that he could do. And that is what this odd encounter proved for Jacob, that Jacob would be wounded and would leave this match limping, but would also leave with a new name, a new identity, Israel. He carried a limp with his new identity, and it seems almost counterintuitive, right? I mean, the Lord dislocated Jacob's hip, and then he blesses him, but he didn't heal the hip. He was blessed, but he limped forward. The Lord blessed him and maimed him in the same encounter. And Jacob was given a new name. While he would still do Jacob things, he had a new identity that the Lord would build upon, Israel. So in this story, we see a limping, sleep-deprived Jacob crossing the river and finally coming face to face with his brother and the 400 men that he was so terrified to meet. He reunites with his dysfunctional family, and he gets ready to face his brother. Now, Jacob had been planning and scheming his whole life. How was he going to get out of this? Now is the time when he was going to meet his brother. Let's look and see what he does. Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. So he does what Jacob does. He divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. And he put the maidservants and the children in front, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. See? Jacob is always going to Jacob. There's always a spin, always a plan, always something that he's scheming or thinking that he can do to ensure his longevity, to ensure that he would be able to survive. Maybe Esau would just take the servants' lives and those kids. I don't care for them quite as much as the other ones. Maybe that's what he was thinking. Maybe he was thinking he'll take them out and I'll just run. Oh no, I can't run. I can only limp. There's always a plan with Jacob. So what else could he do to ensure his life be spared? He's in his last resort. He has nothing else to give his brother. He has no other way to prepare for his brother's wrath. His last resort is that he crosses over before them, in verse 3, and he bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. He gave his possessions. He split his family unit into his least preferred family first. So what else was there to do? Maybe if he humbled himself, if he submitted to his brother, would that be enough? There was no other plan. There was no other scheme. There was no other bribe that he could offer. He had come to the end of himself. He had nothing left to give. So he limped and he bowed 7 times in front of his brother. I want you to picture that in your mind. A middle-aged man limping towards an army of 400 men with big, strong Esau, the warrior, the hunter in front. And Jacob is bowing not once, not twice, but 7 times. One would think, wow, he's really going to get it now. This is the perfect time for Esau to get revenge, end his younger brother, and reclaim his birthright. But we are met with an incredible show of grace in verse 4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him. And they wept. Esau, the one that would live by the sword, the impulsive one, the one that was tricked, the one that said he would kill his brother for that trickery, he ran to meet him, and he embraced him, and he fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and they wept. That doesn't sound like the Esau that I expected. That sounds very similar to Jesus' story of the father and the prodigal son. And it's a shame that the story of Jacob and Esau is usually remembered for Esau selling his birthright for some lentil stew and Jacob tricking his father into giving the blessing to him, because that was the memorable moment that fractured their family. And Jacob would spend 20 years waiting to return, and he was a stubborn, clever man who had come to the end of himself relationally. He was all alone. Financially, he had surrendered everything that he had, and physically, he was left with a limp. Only when he was emptied could he have true healing occur in his life. He couldn't have his mind racing from one plan to the other plan, but he had to be stilled at the feet of the one that he offended. And that right there is the story of Jacob and Esau. Look at what the Lord did. Look at the story. Don't just look at the moments that happened, but the unseen things that were at work in the process, in the waiting. The process is so much greater than the problem that we see. And I've taken you through this story, and I know it was a little bit of a whirlwind, but I just want to ask you 3 questions. 3 questions, and then we're going to wrap up and the band can come up. Number 1, what is fractured in your life? What brokenness are you carrying? What happened in your life that has caused you to feel fractured, emotionally, relationally? What is broken that you're carrying today? Number 2, what might a waiting room look like in your situation? Has God placed you somewhere that you don't want to be? It could be in a workspace. It could be physically in a place. You could be waiting and waiting for something to happen and you feel like it's just not occurring. What might a waiting room look like in your situation? And lastly, what do you need to surrender to be truly stilled and healed? It's not just about waiting and that all time will heal all wounds. That's not true. What needs to be stilled in your heart so that you can receive true healing from the Lord? What do you need to bring at the feet of your Father? What do you need to surrender and bow down in front of the one that you have offended? And say, Lord, I have nothing. I can promise you that the Lord will respond with grace and love and mercy. Don't do like Jacob did and waste 20 years of your life scheming and planning and trying to get through and trying to ensure your longevity. You're going to be exhausted. You're going to be tired. You're going to break relationships and hurt others. Be willing to still your heart. And we all have moments of fracture, difficulty, and sometimes these moments, they can drag on for decades, like we see in Jacob's life. But when we examine the stories we find in the Bible, and when we reflect on our own lives, can't we see the goodness of a good God who constantly is intervening, who is constantly allowing opportunities for us to come to him and surrender everything to him, taking broken people who do broken things, and man, we've really let it get out of control sometimes. But the Lord is able to do beautiful things, even with the broken things. I'm going to invite the band up now. Let me just pray for you guys. We're going to sing a song in just a minute. And in this song, you're welcome to sing along, but I also want you to reflect on those three questions that I mentioned. What's fractured in your life? What might a waiting room look like in your situation? And what can you surrender to truly be stilled and healed by the Lord? Jesus, would you help us? Lord, we thank you for the story of Jacob and Esau and even what you did through the waiting process. And I'd love to know Esau's story and hear what happened to him in those 20 years, for him to be able to offer that incredible grace and love. Lord, we thank you that we have that incredible grace and love waiting for us with you. That though we may hurt, though we may fracture, though we may do things to offend you and hurt you, Lord, you welcome us home. You kiss us, you run to us, you hug us, and you restore us as your sons and daughters. Jesus, with that love that we have received, may we model that out to all of our fractured relationships that we have. Help us to know what phone calls we need to make, what ways we can reconcile with those that we have been broken with. All through the power of your Holy Spirit, all through the power of that incredible gift that you give us, Lord, through your